This is a presentation looking at whether universities can afford to give a decent pay rise this year, and it's based on the University of Sheffield's finances from data that's available in their annual reports. Okay, now here's salary growth at the University of Sheffield. It's the same as salary growth everywhere in the country because of the national pay spine, and this is national pay scale 0.37, which at the University of Sheffield is a starting lecturer's salary. Okay, now the data here goes back to 2009, and you see there that the salary of a new starting lecturer in 2009 was around the 36,000 mark, slightly higher. And then over the next 9 years or so, it's grown, okay, and it's now at just over 40,000. Right, so pay has gone up. Well, of course, that's not taking into account inflation. And if you take into account inflation as measured by RPI, which is one of the two main inflation measures used, then things look very different. And in fact, this is what happens if you adjust the salary growth for inflation according to RPI. You get a curve going steadily down, quite a long way, in fact. So what does this say? Well, everything's been converted to 2009 prices using the RPI inflation measure, and it shows that now the salary in 2009 terms is more like 30 and a bit thousand pounds. So that's a slightly confusing way of looking at it, but basically if people in 2009 were paid at the same essential rate as people are paid today, they'd have only been earning 30,000 and a bit to start as a lecturer. Okay, now this same pay trend, I should say, occurs across the whole pay spine, except for the very lowest points where there have been some slightly bigger pay uplifts. But most people working in universities have had this same decline in pay. Now, the other inflation measure I could have used is CPI, which tends to make things look less bad in terms of pay erosion here. And that's what happens if you look at CPI. So there's still a decline over the last decade, but not to quite the same extent. Now, who knows which one's the true representation of how much pay has gone down? Well, really, there's no such thing. In some sense, you could see that the difference between these two, this kind of wedge, is where the true measure lies. Somewhere between RPI and CPI is likely to measure the effect of this this pay erosion. Okay, now let's get rid of the salary numbers on the left hand side here and change for percentages, because really that's a clearer way of expressing what's going on. And now it's certainly clear that this applies to all points on the pay spine apart from the very lowest points. So you've had this erosion over the past 9 years. The graph stayed the same. The dotted line there is the RPI devalued salaries, and the solid line is adjusted for CPI, and we've ended up at about 84% of the previous salary if we adjust according to RPI, and somewhere around 90% if you adjust according to CPI. So that's how much pay's gone down over the last 9 years. Right, now let's get rid of RPI. I'm going to do things in terms of CPI here, because in some sense anything that's about pay erosion will be worse than, I mean, CPI gives you an upper bound for how much, or a lower bound, whichever one I mean, for how much inflation has affected or how much salaries have eroded over the last 9 years. So let's look at CPI, knowing the true picture is probably even worse than this. Okay, first thing I want to show you is what's happened to the University of Sheffield's Vice-Chancellor over this same period, which is this. Now, you can see that for the first couple of years there was some solidarity shown between the Vice-Chancellor and the staff here, and the salary did decrease. But since then, it's gone up, up, up. And the most recent figures we have, which are from a couple of years ago, we're still waiting for this, the annual report from this year, and we don't know what the VC is currently being paid. But the salary went up by 22%-ish over that time scale. Okay, now the interesting thing is that this is only what's happened over the last 9 years. Suppose you went back further, and in fact the University of Sheffield has annual reports on its website going back to 1999, so we can track back that far. This is the picture. So that solid black line is how the Vice-Chancellor's salary has compared relative to what it was in 1998 and adjusted for inflation. And that dotted line is what happened to the national pay smile. So for the majority of staff at universities. And you can see a big discrepancy here. Vice-Chancellor's salary nearly doubled in real terms over the last 20 years. Staff salaries in general went up for the first 10 years or so, but then fell back down. And that was a bit of the curve we were looking at before. Okay, right. Now, the interesting question is, why is this trend there? Is it down to some kind of problem with university finances? Is that why pay has had to be squeezed? Well, let's look into that a bit more. So this curve is the income at the University of Sheffield, adjusted for CPI and then expressed relative to 1998. So what we see is over the time period from 1998 to 2016-17, the income of the university has more than doubled in real terms. That's what this graph shows. And in fact, it's been going up relatively sharply over recent years, apart from this little kink at the end, which I'll come back to. Remember that the last year's pay, so the last year's income is down on the year before. But other than that, there's been a fast upward trend in recent years. Okay. Now, what happens when you compare that to the increase in VC pay? Interestingly, it follows a similar kind of trajectory. It doesn't follow it precisely, and there is a bit of a gap opening up between the Vice-Chancellor's salary here and the total income for the university. But in some sense, there's a comparable rise between the two here. Interestingly, this is what you often see, I believe, with large businesses, is that the chief executive pay, if you like, the person at the top, their pay goes up according to the size of the company, which is what we're seeing here. Doesn't excuse it, but that's a trend that's seen elsewhere. Now, that's the elite layer, if you like, the person at the top. What about the next layer down? So I've looked at the top 50 employees at the University of Sheffield, not individually, but the university reports on its high earners in the annual reports. And from that, we're able to track the amount it pays on the 50 best paid staff at the university, excluding the VC. This is the trend you see there. So in fact, the salaries of the 50 highest paid people at the university, excluding the VC, went up very sharply in the first 10 years, but then did fall back and follows a similar trend since 2009 or so to what's happened to the rest of the staff at the university. But they still finished this 18, 19-year period something like 38% higher in real terms than they were paid in 98. So there's been a fairly good bit of wage growth there. And then, of course, here's the curve we saw before. This is what's happened to your average staff member at the university. It went up and it came down. We've seen that before. And remember, of course, I said that this was CPI adjusted, and the RPI adjusted would tell a different story, and the truth would be somewhere between the two. Let me show you the RPI curve there, which is interesting because we finished this 20-year period lower in RPI terms than we started it. So the salary of a starting lecturer now, if measured with RPI, is lower in real terms than it was in 1998, which is an interesting fact. Okay, moving on. Here's this income curve again, and let's just compare it first of all to expenditure, because the university in Sheffield, and I would guess lots of universities have said the same, has claimed that while income is rising, expenditure is also rising. And in Sheffield, we've often been told that expenditure is rising faster than income, and hence we have to make efficiency savings and the like. So here is the expenditure curve plotted against that dotted line of income, and you can see that they've tracked each other relatively closely. In recent years, I think it's fair to say that the income has been rising faster than the expenditure, apart from this little tick at the very end. Now, I said I'd say more later on, and I will say even more later on, but I think the main reason for that tick is to do with changes to accounting practices, in particular how grants awarded to the university are accounted for. In some sense, where things used to be smoothed over a number of years, they go in 1 year and then they don't appear in future years. So there's going to be more volatility in this income because of that. So there we go. Right. Okay, but the interesting question is, what's driven that expenditure? Is it staff costs? Is it that the university is paying more on staff than ever before? We often hear phrases like that. Um, is that what's driving this increase in expenditure that's keeping up with this increase in income? Well, not really, no. So there has been an increase in staff costs in real terms compared to 1998, and it is increasing year by year in real terms as we get more staff working here and the like. However, it's increasing at a slower rate than our income. Okay, so staff costs are not keeping pace with the total income of the university. In other words, the university is managing to find savings on its staff costs compared to the size of its operations. So in fact, if you take this data and you plot it in a different way, you can look at the staff costs as a proportion of the total income at the university. And if you do that, you see what's going on here. Back at the beginning of this time period, staff costs were more like 60% of the total income of the university. And from the middle of, so 2007-ish onwards, the university has managed to squeeze those staff costs until they're now more like 50% of the total income of the university. So while it's true that more is being spent on staff than ever before, it's not true as a proportion of the university's overall operations. Okay, certainly falling there. Now let's have a little bit more of a look at the overall figures here. And the operating surplus is the difference between the total income and total expenditure. And you can see an interesting pattern here, which involves some surpluses, some deficits. 20 years ago, there seemed to be a fair bit of fluctuation as to whether we'd post a surplus or a deficit each year. And the figures were relatively small compared with today. But in recent years, we've been posting some pretty healthy operating surpluses. Okay, now there's an issue with that final year, which is partly due to that downtick in income due to accounting measures, but there's other things going on that we'll explore further. Okay, but just focus on that solid surplus generation over the last 7, 8, 9 years. Okay, now I should have adjusted for inflation really here. This is figures not adjusted for inflation. It's fair to do so. That's what things look like when you adjust for inflation. You can still see that in real terms, we're generating more than ever in terms of surpluses. Okay, so what's going on with these figures? Well, there's been a lot of discussion about capital expenditure, both in Sheffield and nationally by UCU. And the big question is, are the squeezes on staff related to the huge amount of building that's going on across the sector? And this graph makes it fairly clear what's going on, or part of the picture here. We are spending more than ever before on buildings. It's not just buildings that go into this expenditure, but it's predominantly buildings. And in fact, the big change in the amount we spent on buildings came around the time that student fees were introduced. So you can see almost a direct link here between, well, not introduced, sorry, the student fees being raised to the high levels they are now. Once that happened and the government opened up competition amongst university for students, you saw a splurge in building. And that's what's happened here. Okay, now again, I should have adjusted for inflation. If you do, you see this. Perhaps it's not quite as dramatic a change, but you do see this discontinuity with more being spent over the last handful of years. Right, now, one question you might have about this is, what effect does that have on these annual figures? Now, in fact, one mistake people could make is to assume that every time you spend on a building, that comes out of your annual results. In fact, it doesn't. If you spend 80 million on a building like the University of Sheffield did with its diamond, it's not the case that your results for that year are 80 million lower than they otherwise would have been. Instead, what happens is the university finances that building out of its savings, out of the accumulated surpluses it's built up over the years, or out of a loan. But at Sheffield, I think I'm right in saying that the university hasn't borrowed very much for such purposes. So essentially, this is money out of savings to pay for a building. So how does it affect the annual figures, well, it affects them through what's called depreciation. Okay, now let's have a look at, we'll get there in a minute. Okay, sorry, I forgot which slide was coming next. Now, depreciation works as follows. You spend 80 million on a building. You say it's got a lifespan of 40 years. You want to be able to rebuild that building at the end of its lifespan. What do? Well, if it's an 80 million building split over and it's expected to last 40 years, what you do is you allocate 2 million a year for the next 40 years to your expenditure. Okay, this is a paper expenditure, if you like. It doesn't actually exist as money flowing out. It's just an adjustment to make sure that over the next 40 years you accumulate enough to rebuild the building that will be falling down. Okay, so it's a sensible thing to do in accounting practices. You could criticize it in some ways, but that's not what I'm going to do now. But the fact is that building buildings does affect your annual expenditure, at least on paper. Right, so now on to the next graph, which is what we call the net cash inflow at the university. Now, essentially, this is something like the income from the university without taking account of the depreciation costs of buildings. It's not quite that simple, but it's somewhere close. Those are the things that make the biggest difference. So if you like, the difference between this and those operating surpluses and deficits predominantly to do with depreciation. Okay, now when we look at these figures, you can see that the University of Sheffield, and I would guess that most universities across the country, have a very healthy net cash generation going on, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So this is, I could adjust for inflation like so, but the university has been generating more money than it's ever generated in annual terms as a result of its operations. Okay, so things are looking healthy here. Plenty of money coming in. How does this turn to the deficits that we've seen before? Well, you have to add in the depreciation. So what is the depreciation costs? What do they look like? Well, there's been quite a shift there. They look like this. So you can see way back at the beginning of the 20-year period, very low depreciation costs. In fact, I wonder whether there's a discontinuity in this data in the sense that the way this was accounted for may have changed. But anyway, you can see a general trend, which is our annual expenditure allocated for depreciation is going up, up, up. Okay, no coincidence that this coincides with our building of new buildings, which each time we do so generates extra depreciation costs to our annual accounts. And you can see that over the last 5 years, these have nearly doubled. So 5 years ago, it was more like 38, 40 billion-ish. And now we're getting on for, sorry, million-ish. And now we're getting on for 80 million a year in depreciation. Okay, so when you see those annual operating surpluses or deficit figures, especially deficits, bear in mind that those are the result of depreciation dragging down a net positive cash generation into negative territory. Okay, and if we hadn't been building so many buildings, then things would look different. Okay, I should have adjusted for inflation. This is the inflation adjusted depreciation expenditure. You can still see the trend of it going up over recent years as we've built a lot of buildings. Okay, so let's just go back to that income and expenditure curve. This is the one I showed before, and we see expenditure tracking income pretty closely. So a question you might ask is, what does this look like if you take out the depreciation from our expenditure? So if we look at everything except for depreciation, and there you get a curve that looks like this. So excuse me. So while expenditure without depreciation added in did rise at the same level as income for the first 10 years or so, in recent years what we're finding is the expenditure on things that aren't depreciation are falling relative to our income. In other words, we're spending less as a proportion of our income on things that aren't related to building costs, which is the point that Plenty and UCU have been making for quite a while, and explains why I think enough is enough in terms of allowing erosion of staff salaries. The money is there and has always been there, but by allowing pay to erode in real terms for staff, this has enabled the building of buildings, which then further drag down the figures, and you get into a vicious spiral of things looking unaffordable. Okay, so that's where I'll finish. Now, of course, there's a pay ballot currently underway for UCU members as to whether industrial action is necessary to shore up pay now. Please do vote in that ballot, whichever way you're going to vote. The branch in Sheffield has advocated yes and yes, as have national UCU. Why? Well, for me, the strongest argument is that this is about protecting intergenerational fairness. So you saw that graph about new starting staff now being paid somewhere between 84% and possibly 90% of what they were paid in 2009. If this carries on, the younger generation coming into the profession will be paid less and less year by year. So something needs to happen. Non-members, if you've been watching this, please consider joining UCU, because the more we have involved, the stronger the voice and the more of a difference we can make.